We're now going to move to our next panel. If I could welcome our moderator, Jennifer Powers from Computering. Marcus Fish, Member of Parliament, is a member of the Parliamentary Commission. Marcus. And I've got Shankar from the chair of the technical panel, and also Robert McLean, who is a partner at Squire, Patton, Bogg. And at this point, I'm going to pass over to Jennifer to tell us a little bit more about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Well, good afternoon. I think we're just on the cusp. Welcome to what has the potential to be one of the more heated discussions here today. I think one of the things that struck me most over the course of the last 6 to 8 weeks whilst working on this project is how important it is to address the challenges around agri-foods on the island of Ireland. We met a lot of people, spoke to a lot of people on our travels from agri-foods sector and communities that are very reliant on that part of the economy. And heard especially from members of the dairy industry, for instance. They don't take long before explaining to you about the very complex supply chains that exist on the dairy industry on the island of Ireland. The amount, I was really struck by, 2.4 billion litres of milk produced per year, and 800 million litres of that goes south for processing. And that's 70 tankers per day going over routes across the border. And the time criticality element of dairy and distressed milk and all the rest of it. So I think if we can crack dairy, if we can crack agri-foods, then we're a great deal along the road in terms of finding credible, practical alternative arrangements that work both for the people and the businesses of Northern Ireland and Ireland. So welcome to the panel. I guess I just wanted to start by really delving a little bit deeper into the frequency and volumes of those agri-food supply chains. Shankar, do you want to start by just talking a little bit about that?
Well, I think you've covered most of the issues. I mean, it is well understood that in the agri-food area you have incredibly complex repeat movements across the border, sometimes 8-9 times across the border for very similar products. I think it is critical that that's the context of our conversation. So there is one area where there is a very specific all-Ireland component to this, which is the sort of grain trade or agricultural foodstuffs trade, things that are intended for animal consumption. And I think it is very important that we build on, Hans had mentioned earlier on, the common bioveterinary security area, or single epidemiological unit, that we can build upon that, and we suggest that in the report. I would certainly bank, amongst all these common areas, I would bank the one that's doable, which is the common single epidemiological unit plus, that gets you the grain trade and the trade that is intended for animal consumption, build on the checks that occur at Lawn now for livestock. And that takes that element of the trade off the table. Now, with respect to the rest, with dairy and other movements and SPS goods moving, this is why we've suggested some alternatives that no doubt we'll come to.
We will come to. Can I just take us back a moment, though, for those of us who perhaps aren't customs professionals? The single epidemiological unit. What does that mean? How does it function?
When people talk about the common biosecurity area and they talk about livestock, it's essentially the area, the all-Ireland area where livestock are essentially checked at Lawn. There are basically 100% physical checks at Lawn. Currently now, and that will continue in the future. And all I'm saying is that we need to use that as a basis, because that exists already, and we can build on that.
So, where did this idea come about? I'm assuming it came from talking to people in the grain trade about the
Yes, no, we've had in our stakeholder conversations, we had a number of conversations with people in the animal feed, livestock, grain area. And that's where, and it's no surprise, going back to what Lord Bew said earlier on in the conversation, it's no surprise that these were the issues that were the front and centre issues on the cooperation areas in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. That basically this was the obvious thing that where you need coordination and cooperation.
So, am I right in saying that your argument is those were agreed as part of the GFA, those areas, and you think it's doable to expand that zone to include feed and
I think it's relatively non-controversial to
we'll
build
find out
on
in a
the
minute,
biosecurity zone and build from that to things that are intended for animal consumption. When it comes to other SPS goods, then we enter into more controversial territory.
Okay.
And what we have to do basically is, look, as Hans said earlier on, there is a general case that involves things like transit. Now, if you don't have any areas, you don't have any common SPS areas, you don't have any of this, then you're going to have to make that process work for SPS trade, and it's more complicated for SPS trade than it is for other areas of trade because of the need for border inspection posts, which typically are at borders, which is where you would put the checks. So that creates a degree of complexity in this area alone. This is why it's sort of carved out from other areas. Now, what you want to do, we think, is look at the general case. How can we make that as least disruptive as possible? And there's only certain things you can do. You need to move those that structure for checks away from the border, obviously. That creates the problem that I think was alluded to earlier on designated roads. There are exemptions for those on the Swedish-Norway border. So this is a derogation we would then need from the EU in a negotiation. So you have a set of derogations that you would need. You would need derogations on the time period that you'd need for pre-notification and those sorts of things. And you want to follow the grain of the EU regulation that is changing in this area. The EU regulation is moving more towards being able to do checks away from what are typically known as border inspection posts. In their new regulations, there'll be border control posts. But the direction of travel is to move checks away from those structures and to allow mobile veterinary checks, these sorts of things, some sort of distributed structure to prevail. Now, that's the general case. Then you build on that.
Okay, let's come back to that. Robert, I just wanted to bring you in. Obviously, you're based in Brussels, and welcome.
Thank you.
Heading up trade and customs practice
Yes.
at the law firm. Can you bring a European perspective to what's happening in these areas?
Sure. I think, well, first of all, you have to go back to the WTO level. It's such a serious issue. The global food chain security situation, that there's an actual WTO SPS agreement that regulates everything. And then you have below that, of course, the European Union's very high level of scrutiny of the food chain and things like that. But as Shankar says, there has been, while those concerns remain, there has been some modifications, if you like, that could be transposed onto the situation in Ireland. One of which I think Hans mentions is a trace system, where you have quite a sophisticated IT platform that SPS goods traders can register in. The products can be tracked, etc., etc. That's a track and trace process. It's not a certification process. So you still need the necessary certificates to accompany that, but it's a way of facilitating that kind of trade. Also, as Shankar mentions in the report, there's the EU-New Zealand meat agreement that provides additional ways of how veterinary certifications can be done on the other side of the transaction, so to speak, before the product comes into EU. Again, that can be transposed into a solution, if you like. And then the new Commission proposal, the proposed regulation that they adopted last year, does indeed say, well, you know, we need to avoid congestion at ports. We need to avoid the disruption, not just at the port of Calais and Dover, but generally speaking throughout the whole of the European area, if you like. So there are concessions being granted with certain conditions, and you do have to apply for approval. But again, as the report says, we can rely on some of them for mitigating the situation in the border.
Okay, so not a dull area at all then. Lots going on. Maybe time to move on to those special cases then before we open up for questions. Shenke, do you want to just very briefly talk about one of the options that is outlined in the report around a special zone?
Well, when it comes to this sort of area, there's only sort of 4 things that one can do. So there's no particular magic to it. One thing is, as we mentioned before, the building on the bioveterinary biosecurity area to encompass products intended for animal consumption. That recognised the reality of trade on the island of Ireland, that in this particular area it's very much north-south. The other thing you can do is try to make the basic case of SPS work, which we talked about and we talk about in the report. The only 2 other things you can do are a common SPS area for the island of Ireland, which has been discussed frequently in the last few months or even years, and has political difficulties associated with it that we have to recognise. Now, our approach there is the UK is not going to diverge in the area of SPS on day one. We aren't going to suddenly start diverging, on let's say we leave on October 31st. So this question doesn't become ripe until that occurs.
Or if it occurs.
Or if it occurs. And so our general approach is a pathway, a possible pathway to a solution here. And again, goes back to the beginning of the discussion, principle of consent. We're not trying to foist a particular view on the people of Northern Ireland. I think ultimately it'll be up to them to decide. So you can actually start with a common British and Irish Isles zone for SPS. This is possible. There are other examples of things like Schengen in the case of the common travel area, where there are differences between, and will continue to be differences between the Republic of Ireland and the EU26, but they would also be, because we start off with no difference in regulation, they would be part of the EU SPS regime, and if the UK were to diverge in the future, they would be able to drop out of that common area, and then the question can be presented for traders and for people in Northern Ireland as to what they want to do with this, and if they decide that they want to lock into a UK SPS area, that's up to them. If they decide they want to lock into the European SPS regime in the island of Ireland, that also will be up to them. We think it is worth investigating this, given that this is a feasible pathway, because the general case of SPS is difficult. I think all the derogations that we need, if you look at the derogations that we would need for the general case of trade, they're all in the SPS area primarily. The barcode is in every area, but most of the derogations are in the SPS area. So, consistent with trying to eliminate problems, this is something I think worthy of investigation. Okay,
thank you. I want to bring in Marcus Fish. You were involved in the Malthouse Compromise discussions with the government earlier this year, and I'm not sure you've had a chance to read all 202 pages, but do you have any initial reactions, based on your experience, to the report that's been published, the interim report?
I think it's a very welcome contribution. Clearly, this particular area is one of the most knotty of the problems that needs a solution. Yeah. And we're all very conscious of the delicate politics of it, and the need to make sure that communities understand that we will do everything within our power to make sure that if there are processes that need to be followed, because we can't agree such things as Shanker was discussing, then the government will be four square behind businesses and communities to defray the costs of doing that, to minimise the impact and make it as easy as we heard before as possible to do that. So we started from the baseline approach that we would have to have a full solution for an assumption that nothing else came along. So that was why we structured the alternative arrangements working group discussions the way that we did. I think that this report goes a bit further in some of those areas. We focused, yes, on the distributed model for using the existing provisions that we heard about earlier within the border inspection post regulations, which allow in special geographic circumstances for checks to take place away from the border.
Yeah.
The EU has told the French in Calais that they will allow that there already. So there is a principle that has been accepted that in order to smooth our relations with the EU, these are flexibilities within the legislation that they're prepared to use. We need to make sure that gets done. We, I think, wanted to make sure as well that we would have a solution, for example, if they didn't grant an exemption on import VAT needs for those under the threshold, we wanted to make sure that that was in there too. But it makes sense to try to see how flexible the EU is prepared to be on these issues in order to minimise the impact on the daily lives of the businesses and the people in this very sensitive area.
Yeah. Well, listen, I know that the refrain of the day is very much that it's a technical report and it's a technical panel, both of which are especially true. But since we've got Marcus on, I just thought I'd ask you, you're one of the commissioners that joined. I think there were 45 or so in all, which is, by parliamentary standards, a really big and wide and disparate group. I mean, you know, getting those of us who've engaged with politicians as part of our professional careers, knows getting more than one of them in a room at one time can be difficult. And we've regularly had sort of 20, 25 commissioners come for parliamentary hearings, and 45 at least, I think, sign up. Were you surprised by the level of interest in what is a rather technical area by your fellow parliamentarians?
Well, not surprised in one sense, because it's a really important thing, clearly the most important thing in a way that's going on in British politics at the moment. So this is a technical area, as you said, but and it isn't something that politicians have had to know about for 40 years, because it was done elsewhere. Yeah. Unless they had a really particular interest in the operations of HMRC and Border Force for some technical reason, because they were MP for Dover or something, like Charlie, then there was no particular reason necessarily to get that involved in it. So it was great to see people across different ends of the argument, as it were, about whether Brexit in itself was a good idea or not in the first place, come together to try to find solutions, because that's, at the end of the day, what people out there expect their politicians to be doing, is focusing on the detail and getting it sorted and getting together and getting it done.
Okay.